Shalom Aleichem and good evening. I'm Ann Toback, the CEO of the Workers' Circle. Welcome to Critical Crossroads, a two-part program with journalist and author Emily Tamkin. The Workers' Circle is a Jewish social justice organization that builds progressive identity through Jewish cultural engagement, the promotion of Yiddish language and traditions, and multi-generational learning, all with the goal of inspiring collective and impactful activism. The history of the Workers' Circle and its mission, along with many other American Jewish histories and identities, is explored in Bad Jews, a history of American Jewish politics and identities, which will be discussed this evening. All of us are thrilled to have 5 co-sponsors for this program who we're highlighting now in the chat. I hope you'll take a look. In what we know will be an incisive look in the past and future of American Jewish identity, we value opportunities like this to work as partners in creating a Shenera and Bessera Welt für alle, a better and more beautiful world for us all. Tonight and next week, Workers' Circle creative consultant Anthony Russell will be interviewing journalist Emily Tamkin, the author of both Bad Jews and her previous book titled The Influence of Soros. Emily is now at work on a third book on Holocaust remembrance in pop culture, politics, and foreign policy. Emily is a contributing columnist at The Forward and writes regularly for The New Republic, Slate, and The Washington Post, among other publications. She has been the recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship, a Heinrich Boll Fellowship, a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship, and was part of the inaugural class of Shalom Hartman Writers and Journalists. Emily lives in Washington, D.C. Anthony Mordechai Zvi Russell is a multidisciplinary artist working in the medium of Yiddish language and culture, a former AJU Public and Mandel Institute Cultural Leadership Fellow, and present Mitchell J. Gerstein Distinguished Visiting Artist in Residence at the University of Toronto. Anthony has expanded his work into exploring the intersection of racial justice and Yiddishkeit. Anthony has been a cultural consultant with the Workers' Circle since the fall of 2020, and he is an essayist in a number of publications, including The Forward, Tablet Magazine, and Jewish Currents. Anthony lives in San Diego, California, with his husband, Rabbi Michael Rothbaum. Welcome, Emily and Anthony. And Anthony, I am thrilled to be turning the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Jewish author, folklore researcher, political activist, and playwright of the Dybbuk, Shin Ansky, once wrote, quote, "There's no other people like the Jewish people that talks about itself so much, but knows itself so little." Undoubtedly, Shin Ansky was writing about the early 20th century Eastern European Jewish milieu he lived and worked in. But it turns out American Jews are no exception to this statement, as proven by the book we're discussing today, Bad Jews, A History of American Jewish Politics and Identities, written by our guest, journalist and author, Emily Tamkin. Emily, it's a pleasure to have you with us this evening.
I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be in conversation with you, Anthony, and I've been a Yiddish student at the Workers' Circle online on and off for 5 years, so it's really quite special to be doing this event with them.
It's great to have you. In reacquainting myself with your book over the past few weeks, I've been reading it on various forms of public transit, always to the alarmed and perplexed stares of my fellow writers. So I have to ask you, how did you come up with the title Bad Jews, and what about the concept of the bad Jew made you want to write this book?
I'm going to read a tweet from November 2011, which is quoted in the introduction of the book and which really stuck with me as I was thinking of the subject and going over what this book could be. This quote is from someone who I do not often quote for inspiration. It's noted podcaster Ben Shapiro. And the tweet reads, "The Jewish people has always been plagued by bad Jews who undermine it from within. In America, those bad Jews largely vote Democrat." Now, obviously, that's a rich text. And we'll be going over some of the themes therein over the course of the next hour. But that, just the way that he put it really, really stuck with me, right? This idea that this is an eternal issue, and that there is a group of Jews within who shouldn't really be within. Um, and while I don't agree with him about, I sort of don't agree with his the conclusion that he draws, but I do think the more I thought about it, the more I thought that yes, this has been going on for in one way or another, certainly for as long as there have been American Jews. And when one goes back into Jewish history, one understands that it predates that. I wrote this book. It came out of my first book on George Soros. One of the things that I kept coming up against was the idea that conspiracy theories, not criticism, but conspiracy theories about him couldn't be anti-Semitic because he wasn't really Jewish, because he didn't go to synagogue, or because he wasn't sufficiently supportive of Israel, or because of how he spoke about his own relationship to Jewishness, or his lack of donation to explicitly Jewish causes, on and on. And this really, really bothered me, right? Like, who gets to say that somebody is not Jewish enough to be the target of an anti-Semitic smear campaign? Um, and when I sat with it, I thought, well, what is this? Is this really bothering me because of Soros, or is it me? Is it my own relationship to my identity and to its relationship in this country and this broader world? Um, so that's, and I have to say that from the minute I started, this book was only ever bad Jews to me, right? The reactions to it are either people really get it, they get it immediately, they've been called this, they've called themselves this, they totally in their bones feel this concept. Or alternatively, some people have been very offended by the fact that I had the audacity to put the word bad in front of the word Jews. And I guess there's no way to say this without sounding defensive, but I just think that that's such a bad faith reaction. Obviously, if people can't help if people are offended, if that's their initial response, that's their reaction. But the book is not called Jews Are Bad. The book is called Bad Jews, which is a term that we throw against one another and toward ourselves. And I think especially if if you've never come across it as a Jewish person, like Mazel Tov, but perhaps read the book and you will, which I believe is a loving, nuanced portrait of American Jews and our politics and identities. And you'll see that others have been on the receiving end of this concept or this term, and that we've used it to, you know, to try to say who is Jewish enough, who gets to speak as a Jew, who gets to have who has the luxury of thinking through their relationship to their identity.
Right. Who has the ability to be able to sort of drive the narrative as to what it is to be Jewish, what it is to be good and Jewish, what it is to be bad and Jewish. What really impressed me about this book is that one tends to think about Jewishness as being this inherently static thing that never changes, that it's merely the setting or the circumstances that change. What Bad Jews proves page after page is that America is a kind of ultimate challenge to the idea of an eternal, unchanging Jewishness, that America changes Jews and their relationship to each other, even as Jews impact the narratives that America tells about itself, what America is, or perhaps what America could be. As you mentioned in the book, you can even see this on the base of the Statue of Liberty, where the famous words by Jewish poet Emma Lazarus actively reinterprets the meaning of the statue. Quote, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." The interesting thing is that you can also see this in the comments that Trump political advisor Stephen Miller made about that particular poem, where he attempted to disavow its words as having anything to do with the kind of country that America should be, in his opinion. Bad Jews is in 9 chapters, each one exploring a different kind of American Jew. Though as to the badness of each kind of Jew, well, you're going to have to read the book yourself if you really want to find out what the nature of the badness is, as it were. In the first chapter, titled Foreign Jews, you look at the 500-year history of Jewish migration to the Americas through the lens of circumstances that brought your families to the US at the turn of the century, specifically your father's family, fleeing the daily reality of pogroms, of which you had relatives who were victims in what was then the Russian Empire. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I really appreciated not only the fact that you begin from a place of personal familial narrative, but that you really continue to explore from that personal narrative throughout the book. It encourages the reader, including me, to find parts of ourselves in the politics and the identities that are explored in the book. And eventually to realize the probability that for someone out there, we're probably bad Jews ourselves, which was really interesting experience to have reading this book. In this chapter, and in another chapter titled Refugee Jews, which is primarily about Jews from the former Soviet Union and Iran, there's a tension that arises over how to keep a sense of one's Jewishness reconciled with this giant thing called America, which historically hasn't exactly seemed to know what to do with the Jews or Jewishness itself. Many American Jews have their own familial stories about how this issue was like reconciled or not in the past. Do you think the tension of balancing Jewishness and Americanness is still an issue for American Jews today?
Well, first I should say that the first chapter, yes, it includes, it sort of goes, the book really is focused on the last century. I don't want readers to think that that it's an in-depth, that I cover in-depth 500 years of American
Right, but
history.
you do
But
start
I
with
do
like
sort of,
the very first Jews who come here, which I think a lot of people don't really have knowledge of.
no, I think a lot of people don't. I mean, there have been Jews in this country since before there was a country.
Right.
To your actual question, I think first we should say that I'll answer it like this: yes, but in a different way. By that I mean two things. First, we should remember that my family has been for many American Jews. The story is my family's story, which is somebody, or people came over at the beginning of the turn of the century, and they lived in sort of an ethnic enclave in a city on the East Coast, and then their children move out in the post-war period, and they acculturate and assimilate, and then 2 generations later, the granddaughter writes a book about Jewish identity, and like, yes, that is one common story, but we should note, and this is in the book, that this is not the only story of immigration to the United States, and so there are still some Jews, and from either they're from Venezuela or from Iran or from wherever, for whom the immigration story is more recent, and for whom the question of what does it mean, like what does it mean that my family is in America now, is a live one. Not that it isn't live for those of us whose families have been here for a century, but it's sort of, we were born as American, right? There are some for whom that's not true for themselves or for their parents. So yes, the answer for those people is yes, right? And I think for all Jews, it still is a question, just not as it was 100 years ago. So for example, I don't have to think about, will my cousin be allowed to come into the country, because I, as a white presenting Ashkenazi American Jewish woman, don't have to think about, will my cousin be allowed to come into the country, or will there be, will we be considered insufficiently white or insufficiently able to assimilate, and so we won't, so they won't be allowed to come and live here. That's not the question of American Jewishness anymore. I do think there's a live question in this political moment as to whether or not you want to insert yourself into the vision of American nationalism that's being presented today, right? I saw on social media somebody saying, I've never felt so Jewish and so un-American as I do in this moment, which I thought was an interesting way of putting it. So I think that we're still thinking about, well, what does it mean to be Jewish in America? Am I an American Jew? Am I Jewish American? Like, how do I how do I relate to the powers that be? How do I relate to the political process? What does it mean to have both of these identities in this moment? Yes, that's still a live question. It's just that for many, many American Jews, it's not a live question in the same way that it was when they were immigrants or their parents were immigrants.
Got it. In the chapter White and Red Jews, you look at how Jewish interactions with racial hierarchies in America intersected and clashed with various kinds of unfolding American Jewish identities. The labor-associated, politically engaged, urban Jewish leftist of the kind the worker circle has historically been associated with, but also another burgeoning Jewish identity for whom communism, socialism, and the more foreign aspects of Judaism were a liability in achieving a suburban life primarily informed by post-war white middle-class existence. And I'm saying this as a product of a suburban Jewish institution born out of this phenomenon. I want to give a shout out to Congregation Sons of Israel in Nyack, New York, where I became a Jew. So like I was reading into this, very personally, because I came out of this kind of suburban phenomenon of Jews in the mid-century. A great many Jews come out of one or both of these phenomena, or even a mixture of the two, the suburban Jewish leftist or the assimilating Jewish urbanite. Given how familiar most American Jews are with these particular types, how much do they still apply to American Jews today? Do they still exist, or did they transform into something else?
I would say both, right? That they still exist and they transformed. You're talking about the process that I describe in the book of, American Jews in the post-war period moving out, many American Jews in the post-war period moving out to the suburbs, finding themselves less connected to the ethnic enclave that I described earlier, to the sort of Yiddishkeit. And there's an extent to which this is just a natural process. And there's also an extent to which communal Jewish organizations really work to say what being Jewish in America will mean is that we are white Americans who pray differently. The charitable read or the generous read on that is that this was done because it was safer, it was more legible to the American mainstream. The ungenerous or more cynical read is that, and both of these reads have a degree of truth to them. The more cynical read is that this was done because the people who ran these institutions really did not want American Jewish life to be communist, right? They and took the opportunity of the Red Scare, of the post-war period, of suburbanization to say, to sort of rid American Jewish institutional life of that element. Obviously, we're in a different time now. It's not the 1940s and 50s anymore. I would say two things, however. One, I think if your listeners, if you, our lovely audience, are interested, there's two books. One is called Ambivalent Embrace, and one is called Torn at the Roots. And both sort of explore this process and explore both how the children of the people who moved out to the suburbs and said, oh, I'm a white American who prays differently. How their how they themselves, but especially their children, grappled with whether that was like authentically Jewish, and looked, and looked to Yiddishkeit, to the left, to try to reassert what it meant to be an American Jew, certainly politically. And I think what both of these books show very elegantly is that there's sort of a cycle, right, where these people start out doing that and then become the institutions that they were once pushing against, or sort of become their parents, right? They take on the post-war American Jewish identity. The other thing that I would say is that today, I think that we are seeing a similar struggle within American Jewish institutions. This isn't totally an answer to your question, but it's the struggle between like what mainstream American Jewishness says it's going to be and where what is fighting for a place within it. And today, the way that the place where I see that is around anti-Zionism and Palestinian rights. I think today it's not so much, oh, we're going to, open our rolls and tell the federal authorities who the communists are. But I do think that there are mainstream American Jewish institutions today who are happy to throw in their lot with those saying, yeah, we'll use, we'll use fear of Palestinians and fear of growing support for anti-Zionism or losing support for Israel to say that, well, one, to go along with anti-democratic practices, in my opinion, and two, to say, yeah, these people aren't even really Jewish. So that's where I see the tension today. It's not necessarily, and there are, I think there are younger Jews who are aligned with the thinking that's being cast out, who do try to pull on the tradition of the Bund or of the diaspora, or who use the sort of leftist mentality. But to me, the struggle is less about class and more about Israel and Zionism and Palestinian rights.
Right. In your chapter, Civil Rights Jews, I really appreciated that you not only provided a very nuanced profile of the various stances of American Jews and their relationship to the mid-century civil rights movement, but also managed to explore the issue of the rights of women in the American Jewish community, identity politics, and the scapegoating of supposed demographic crises on women within the American Jewish community. I'm really struck reading your book about how the civil rights movement exists as an inflection point for American Jews, not just between Jews and Black folks, obviously, but between Jews and themselves, between Jews and their concept of what America is about. It's a well-documented phenomenon that American Jews look back on the mid-century civil rights movement as one in which Jewish involvement was a decisive element, even as the documented history tells a more complicated and less triumphant narrative of American Jewish communal response to the civil rights movement. Given that yesterday the Supreme Court lifted restrictions on ICE making immigration stops in LA based on the ethnic characteristics or spoken language or employment status of the people it seeks to detain, I wanted to ask you, what contemporary civil rights issues do you anticipate the American Jewish community of the future viewing as an important element of their American Jewish identity, as obviously a lot of American Jews view the civil rights movement as being an important part of their American Jewish identity?
Before I answer that, I want to say that there was a review of my book that came out in the UK where, because I write about, as you say, I write about how, it's both true that Jews were overrepresented in the civil rights movement, that many Jews were involved, and that's something that Jews today are, in my opinion, rightfully proud of. And also that it's not as though every Jew is supportive of the civil rights movement. Many were not. Many were not, or many were yes, but, or many were quite patronizing in their involvement, or sort of, or it didn't include women, or it was sort of.
I do want to say really, really briefly, Rabbi David Cooper is in the chat. He's mentioning Heschel. Heschel really comes out a winner in this book. I mean, consistently on the right side of history throughout this book, and as such, really exists as an exemplar of how to embody values in an American landscape in which, even many of the institutions that existed at the time did not want to register what their reaction was to something like the civil rights movement.
And his daughter, Susanna Heschel, who is a professor and a Jewish thinker in her own right, is also, I interviewed her for the book, and she's somebody who was very influential on my thinking about Jews in this period and gender, and so if you read it, the Heschels are there.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. I know Susanna, and yes, the things that she had to say, especially around the sort of intermarriage crisis or the stress that was put on Jewish women, concerning demographic crises.
Well, I'll just say, I mean, I can be more explicit, which is that one of the sort of cleavages in the civil rights era is that, the story that we tell is that Jews sort of broke with the civil rights, or that white Jewish Americans broke with Black Americans over affirmative action. because they were worried about quotas and how quotas would affect them, because they had this memory of the early 20th century and quotas in universities and how they were discriminatory, etc. And that is a valid, like, that did happen. But her point was that as a Jewish woman, in fact, affirmative action had been very helpful to her career, and that that's left out of the narrative. So anyway, so I write this in the book, and this reviewer said that in pointing out that not every Jew was in or was involved in the civil rights movement, I was being too hard on other Jews, which I thought was very funny, because like, that's one of the more Jewish things about me, such as it is that I was hard on fellow Jews. I think Jews being hard on one another is something else that comes out and comes through in the book. But anyway, to actually answer your question, because you asked specifically what American Jews will remember from this time period, I want to say that I think the defining, when American Jews, even 10, 5, 10, 20 years from now, look back on this moment, the way that we will assess sort of the way that we will assess where they stood and how they chose to show up will be when people with power chose to use anti-Semitism and rising anti-Semitism and fear of rising anti-Semitism to justify anti-democratic, xenophobic crackdowns. What did they say and do? Did they say, that's wrong? You're not using my name to do this. You're not fighting anti-Semitism. In fact, your administration is full of people who have been caught promoting and normalizing and elevating white supremacist rhetoric, and that it does not make me safer to throw people without due process into a camp or try to deport college students for writing an op-ed? Or will they say, yes, I agree, I think finally someone is taking anti-Semitism seriously? To me, that will be when we assess American Jewish individuals, institutions, organizations, and how they comported themselves right now in 2025, that's what we'll look at.
I really like that answer, because that really does go to the heart of a number of issues that are informed by that particular issue, like that is being used in so many different kinds of ways in relationship to so many different kinds of issues that are facing American Jews today. I found myself really fascinated with your chapter, Right-Wing Jews. Somebody in the chat had mentioned Commentary Magazine, so like perfect timing. I was fascinated for a couple of reasons. The first is that when one works primarily in progressive Jewish spaces, one either encounters the contention that right-wing Jews scarcely exist, or that if they do, they move in circles that are so distant and rarefied as to be an abstraction. So, I mean, to have an entire chapter about this as a phenomenon was really interesting to me. The second reason I was fascinated is because of my age, and perhaps your age as well. There's an entire generation of Jewish neoconservatives whose work and influence on American policy I knew very little about. I guess I was a child during the heyday of their influence on American policy. One could make the case under the first Trump administration that there was a kind of renaissance of the right-wing American Jewish intellectual, but looking back from the standpoint of the second administration now, there seemed to have been very little in the way of intellectual production of any kind going on, and very little influence on the whole. In this chapter, and in the following chapters, like This Land is Our Land, Jews, you reason that conservative and right-wing orientation are as much a part of American Jewish identity as a historically leftist progressive political orientation with which many of us are conversant. What can politically progressive Jews learn from acknowledging and observing this particular reactionary streak in American Jewish identity?
Yes, I would say, I think it's, so somebody in the chat said, who are you to say who's a good Jew and a bad Jew? And I don't want to like spoil the ending of the book, but I don't in the book say who's a good Jew or a bad Jew, right? Like, I have my own opinion as to what's meaningful and what's right and what's wrong. But one of the points of the book is that who is the bad Jew depends on, and what the right way, like it depends on, every Jew is somebody else's bad Jew. It could be your own. And it really, and that it's such a rich history and tradition that you can you can find whatever it is you're looking to justify, you can find it in Judaism and in Jewishness. So having said that, obviously I'm here giving a talk at the Workers' Circle. There's a certain set of Jewish traditions and American Jewish traditions on which I prefer to pull. It is not the only one. And I don't think we do ourselves, I think it's a race to the bottom to say, this is the real tradition. That's not even really Judaism. Like you can find justification for their positions in American Jewish history and Jewish history and in Judaism. And I think it's better to be honest about that and say, yes, that's in there. And I think it's wrong, right? Like, yes, this history exists and it was bad and it was shameful. And those aren't they're your Jewish values, and that's something that you should sit with for yourself, but they're not my Jewish values, and I don't appreciate being spoken for in this way. So one, I think it's more honest. And two, I think it's important to note that at least for the 20th century, it is both true that conservative American Jews have been a political minority and that it has been an influential minority, right? Most American Jews were not voting like the commentary writers were voting, and yet that thinking had an outsized, I think had outsized influence on American Jewish political life. And I think that's true today too, right? Like when you read every election, I read all these articles about how this is it. This is the moment that American Jews are going to break for the Republican Party. It has not happened yet. But why are there all those articles, right? It's not that like we journalists get in a room every 2 to 4 years and decide, okay, we're going to do another spate of these articles. It's because, in my opinion, one of the reasons is that this conservative American Jewish voices are quite loud. And I think one of the things that the Worker Circle is very effective at doing, and groups like the Worker Circle, is to say that is actually that, when we talk about what matters to American Jewish voters, like, no, voting rights also matter to American Jewish voters. Immigrant rights also matter to American Jewish voters. Abortion rights also matter to American Jewish voters. But that's not always, it's a minority of American Jewish voters who say that their top issue is Israel. And yet when we cover American Jewish voters, often that is where the focus is. Or, when Eric Adams goes to tout his ties to American Jewish voters, he goes to traditionally Orthodox communities. Those are Jewish voters, right? Like that, absolutely, that's a legitimate, that's Jewish outreach, but it's not the only Jewish outreach. And so that's one of the things that I was hoping to remind people of in the book.
Not only the things you listed, abortion rights, voting rights, not only are those are things that are of interest to Jewish voters, but they're also issues upon which Jewish voters can be in solidarity with so many other different kinds of voters. And I think that's why it's of interest to organizations like the Worker Circle that have a really long history of interethnic and cross-ethnic solidarity, solidarity with people of different classes, solidarity with people of different ethnic backgrounds and races. Because I mean, it makes sense. These are issues that affect all of us. It affects Jews, but it also affects all of us as well.
Right. I did a talk shortly before the election in New York City in person, and I said that the per polling, the main issue the issues that came up on top for American Jewish voters were democracy and abortion rights. And a gentleman in the front row yelled at me and said that wasn't true, that it was Israel. And I'm sure that for him, what I was saying, for him, that he was speaking his truth, right? But as I pointed out to him, I was citing polling, and I think it's a real one of the things that this book tries to do and that my work tries to do is I just think it's a real failure of imagination to insist that every other American Jewish person is thinking like you, and that if they are not thinking like you, that they're not really Jewish. That, I mean, first of all, it's a failure of imagination. It's also, it's literally not true. So it's also factually incorrect. And that's one of the things that I try to communicate, have tried to communicate in the book and also in the work I've done before and since.
I mean, what you've identified is the what I will call the bad Jew paradigm, right? you're a bad Jew and also you're not Jewish. Okay, so which is
Mhm.
it?
Yes.
Like this kind of rhetoric, this kind of discourse isn't really doing as much work as the people who use it think it is.
Well, it's saying that I write about this. It's saying that rather than have the argument with you, I would rather just cancel you out as an interlocutor. Um, that's fine. I do think it's important that the rest of us note that that's not actually the same thing as winning the argument.
Exactly, exactly. I'd like to focus for a bit on the chapter titled Pushing Jews, because this is the chapter in which I, and I think many people watching today, find ourselves in our contemporary American Jewish moment. To quote the book, over the past decade, a few trends have taken hold of American Jewish communities. One is that American Jews, and particularly younger American Jews, have grown more detached from and critical of Israel, and indeed from American Jewish institutional life more generally. Another is that American Jewish institutions, broadly speaking, have not adapted, continuing to pursue the same policies and party lines they have since the post-war period. You go on to write, quote, in light of all this, some American Jews looked around and have decided to do what, contrary to certain narratives, some American Jews have always done, to try to change the way things are in American Jewish life. So in this book, and specifically in this chapter, you chart the rise of American Jewish organizations, publications, individuals, and movements who are working to bridge the gap between where American Jews are, where they could be, and what they could be actively advocating for. In this chapter, that includes J Street, Ben the Arc, If Not Now, JVP, Jewish Currents, Svara, Amud, queer representation in American Jewish spaces, the fight against Ashkenormativity in American Jewish culture, the critique of Ashkenormativity as a concept itself, the work of cartoonist Eli Valley, the presidential candidacies of Bernie Sanders and Michael Bloomberg, young leadership in Zionist groups, and young leadership in groups explicitly critical of Zionism. These are individuals and groups of people engaged in the work of actively addressing consequential Jewish issues of today, such as the conflict in Israel-Palestine, anti-Semitism, and the various competing definitions thereof, radical access to traditional Jewish learning, and access to traditions in Jewish language and culture itself. For example, you've included Michal Yashinsky, an accomplished playwright, translator, and instructor in the Yiddish language with the Worker Circle. I believe you refer to him as Lehrer Yashinsky, which I
Yes.
really, yeah, Lehrer Michal, that's
Yeah.
right. I love that. If you were to write another book based on this chapter alone, and including the not inconsiderable amount of things that have changed since you wrote this book, what would that book look like? What contemporary phenomena in American Jewish life would you cover in a book based on this chapter?
There are so many different ways that I could answer this question, but two trends that I think are in the book, but have really moved to the fore since it came out are as follows. The first is the use of anti-Semitic tropes to villainize people who are not Jewish, and how different American Jews have responded to that. So I'm thinking specifically of the way in which the language that we saw in the early 20th century, and in fact in the middle of the 20th century, toward Jews, that you can never really assimilate, you're a national security threat, the sort of perpetual foreignness of the American Jew, how that's been used against Muslims, and how different American Jews have responded. I also think that much of the language around trans people today is quite, if you listen carefully, it doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme with anti-Semitism, right? This is a very small portion of the population that is somehow responsible for, like, corroding all of our children. Obviously that's not true. That's a hateful conspiracy. But I do think that it's sort of similar to how anti-Semitism works. And I think looking at where different American Jewish individuals and organizations fall on this and how they respond to anti-Semitic tropes when the target is not Jewish, and what that does to political discourse, I think is interesting. Chilling, but interesting. The other one, and you mentioned this, I do write about the different the competition over definitions of anti-Semitism. But I think
a lot of people don't even know that the person who created the IRA definition of anti-Semitism no longer supports that.
Well, he doesn't support turning it into law, right? Like the
Right.
IRA definition, which for those who don't know, it's a definition of anti-Semitism that includes examples, some of which are you can't compare Israel to Nazi Germany, or you can't have double standards for Israel. You know, people, including myself, have said could be used to chill legitimate criticism of Israel and also of free speech. So, for example, Professor Bartov at Brown wrote a piece in The Guardian basically saying, I'm a scholar of genocide. I've looked at Nazi Germany. I'm looking at Israel. And very explicitly draws this comparison. Is Israeli professor of the history of genocide, Bartov, an anti-Semite? Like, is that where we're going to spend our energy in fighting anti-Jewish hatred? Or is this a scholar who's looking at the world in a way with which you might disagree, right? But who's not motivated by hatred toward Jewish people? He's motivated by his own expertise and knowledge base. Or the idea of a double standard, right? Like, when another country is the main recipient of U.S. aid, or another, or or another conflict is the deadliest for journalists, like then perhaps it will be given the same attention by people who are protesting war, or by journalists who are concerned about the death of their colleagues. So one can see how, and I want to say, like, I'm not against IRA as a tool in the toolbox. I just think that there are other tools. That there are other tools, I should say, in the interest of full disclosure. I've worked with Nexus, which has a different definition as on their. I'm a fellow at their task force, which is a group of academics who think deeply about sort of what is anti-Semitism and how do we respond to it, and how do we respond to its instrumentalization. So one, I don't think it's the only tool in the toolbox, and two, I think to turn it into law as the exclusive definition is kind of like having a hammer in your toolbox and saying, this is by law the only thing you can ever use to fix anything in your house, right? Like it's not going to help hang things in your house. And in fact, in many cases, or maybe it helps sometimes hang things in your house, but like it's actually going to dismantle a lot as well. And probably your house will not look better at the end of it. And I just think in this moment, where we are seeing politicians use the charge of anti-Semitism to go after free speech, free assembly, immigrants, etc., the push to turn it into law is quite dangerous. And I would also say that it's interesting because there are Jewish groups for whom turning this into law is like the main priority, and that if they can only pass this, anti-Semitism will be passed, and it's worth compromising on whatever other issue in order to get this passed. And I just have to say, I think that's a really bad, this is me personally, obviously, if I were to write this in the book, I would give more of a platform to their point of view. I just have to say, I think that's a really bad trade, because it's not going to work, right? Like, you can make this, you could theoretically, this could become law, and that will make it easier to legally go after people who have said XYZ. But it's not going to magically make people stop believing it, right? It's not going to make people stop saying it. It will just raise the cost for them to say it. And I further don't think that using punitive measures to go after allegations of anti-Semitism, as opposed to, say, education or nuance or creating room for pluralism and different perspectives, is going to help in the fight against anti-Semitism. So that's what I would include in Bad Jews 2.0, which is, I'm writing a book on Holocaust consciousness.
All right, so we'll talk after you're done with that book, and perhaps perhaps that's where it will come in. What I found really interesting about Bad Jews as a book is that it was published 3 years ago, and it covers at least a couple of centuries of American Jewish history. And yet, even in our present circumstances, in the middle of the second Trump administration and a post-October 7th world, the historical dynamics and tensions around politics and identity in the American Jewish community are extremely relevant today. I did not read this book like, oh, I'm reading a document from a former time. I mean, pretty much everything about the dynamics between politics, between ethnicity, culture, identity, these things are still very much at play, What do you think that ultimately the fact that so many of these things, both the historical things and the things that are contemporary, are still relevant? What do you think that says about the nature of being Jewish in America?
I think that one of the constants of American Jewishness and of American Jewish tradition and of American Jewish identity is that it's always changing. And so thus you have this tension where the identity remains, but we're always going to be grappling with it because we're always changing. Our surroundings are always changing. We learn more, we come into contact with different people. Um, and so I think it shows that change is a constant of tradition, right? And this idea of, oh, if we just did things the way that we did back in whatever country we were before we came here, or oh, if we just did things like at the turn of the century, or oh, if we just did things in the post-war period, there's this very nostalgic tension, this very nostalgic tradition in American Jewish history, which is funny because you're always looking back, right? Like none of them thought that they were being authentically Jewish. They were always looking back at what came before, and also always creating the new thing to be nostalgic about, always creating the new Jewish authenticity. So I think it suggests that, and I think, listen, I think being Jewish in this country is beautiful, right? I think it's such a rich tradition. It's a rich identity. It's so there's so much there to explore and to be. I also think it can be really painful because I think that whenever you're any kind of minority, you're trying to make yourself legible both to the wider whole, which is fraught, and to one another. You're saying, I want you to see me as like you. And when someone tells you, oh, you're doing that wrong, or that fear that you have inside, even like I asked everybody that I interviewed um, for this book, when I say bad Jew, what comes to mind? And the number one answer, it was not close, was I think of myself. The number two answer was Stephen Miller. Um, and but I think that it shows that beauty and that pain, and that vulnerability that comes with embracing identity or not embracing identity, right? Like you're stuck with it. Um, that's a constant too.
I think that's a really great answer. I'm now going to go over to the Q&A. We have one question there. If people have questions for us, I invite people to use the Q&A box in order to put those questions.
So the
Provided
chat's been popping
the
off.
chat has been a little on the spicy side. I'm feeling nostalgia for like, circa 2021 when that was the place, the Zoom chat was the place
Right.
to really speak out. Um, so in relationship to what you discuss in this book about politics and identities amongst American Jews, um, what is the role of Jewish intergenerational trauma? How does that affect, or how is that played out in American Jewish identity?
It's such an important question. It's such an important question because I, I did, sorry to keep referencing other talks at this talk. It's kind of like being at your friend's wedding and you keep talking about your own wedding. But anyway, I did a talk and a woman asked me, um, she talked about the difficulty that her father, who survived the Holocaust, and her daughter, who was around my age, were having in discussing Israel. And I said, I think what is important to realize is that um, they were both shaped by history. Like cannot your father can only have lived the life that he lived, shaped by the experiences that he had. And that's why he's coming to the conclusions that he's coming to. And I think it is equally important to remember that so is your daughter, right? Like growing up in a post-Oslo a post-Oslo world, or where Netanyahu has been prime minister for almost the entirety of your life, where you've only ever seen this get worse, where every day you turn on the news and there's more killing and more dying, like that is also being shaped by history. And so I think that and I'm not trying to compare, like obviously I'm not trying to compare reading the news to being a Holocaust survivor, but you're both shaped by they were both shaped by their experiences and their lived history. The other thing is that I think that Jewish trauma, so the sort of twin pillars of, no, the three pillars of 20th century American Jewish identity were Holocaust remembrance, Israel, and Jewish continuity. And so making sure that we married Jewish people and had Jewish babies. I think that each of these comes from a generation of American Jews who mostly did not survive the Holocaust because they were in the United States, but watched as either their family or their friends or people who they thought could have been them experience this, or didn't live to experience, or who were slaughtered. And this sense of guilt, this sense of shame, the sense of fear, right? Who while that was happening, by the way, there were discriminatory laws, anti-Jewish immigration laws being passed here. I think that trauma really shaped how American Jews, for the most part, the posture they assumed toward power and toward especially national power, and the sort of pillars around which they shaped 20th century American Jewish identity. But those pillars were never going to hold forever, right? Because other generations are born and they're not shaped, but they don't live through the same thing, and they're not shaping through so that, and you, like, yes, the trauma is passed on, but it warps, it twists and turns and contorts itself, and it is expressed in new ways by new generations. And I think that that's one of the things that we're seeing today.
Thank you so much for that answer. Unfortunately, because of time, we don't have time for any other questions, but I really want to encourage people on this call to join us for our next conversation next week. And I will try to carve out a little bit more time for us to have people contribute to this important conversation. Emily, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation next week. In chapter 6 of Bad Jews, titled Laboring Jews, we get a cameo appearance from our Workers' Circle CEO, Ann Tobak, and another from a past Workers' Circle interview subject of mine, Professor Hasia Diner, as they outline the relationship between American Jewish political identity and the labor movement. This chapter then rather deftly shifts to the phenomenon of Jews in the world of American finance, a setting in which we discover a number of tropes, among them conspiratorial and anti-Semitic ones, focused on the person of Hungarian-American investor and philanthropist George Soros. Please join me and Emily Tamkin next week for the second part of my interview focused on her book titled The Influence of Soros: Politics, Power, and the Struggle for an Open Society. That will be on Tuesday, September 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And now it's time for me to raffle a copy of the book we've been discussing today, Emily Tamkin's Bad Jews, A History of American Jewish Politics and Identities. Okay. Do I know who the winner is? Where is that information going to come from? As we all wait, I'd love to do a little drum roll. Aha. Okay. The winner is Sarah Eisen. Sarah Eisen, you are the winner of Bad Jews: A History of American Jewish Politics and Identities by our guest today, Emily Tamkin. So I'd like to invite you to join the Workers' Circle next Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern and every Monday until November 4th, as we make calls to voters of color in Virginia ahead of an important Virginia election that is happening this fall. We will be providing resources that make it easier to check where voters are registered and to find needed nonpartisan voting information. We're phone banking in collaboration with the Center for Common Ground, complementing on-the-ground grassroots efforts led by people of color in Virginia and beyond. You can make calls from anywhere in the country, and no previous phone banking experience is necessary. Again, that is next Monday and every following Monday. On Thursday, September 25th at 7 p.m., join the Workers' Circle and the Center for Common Ground for the next installment of our How to Be an Effective Advocate series. Each month, Effective Advocate provides a chance for us to gather with a warm community for updates on how current events are affecting our democratic system, learning about key federal legislation, and training on concrete actions you can take as an advocate for a better and more beautiful world. That's Effective Advocate on Thursday, September 25th at 7 p.m. Have you considered starting a democracy circle in your area to build local grassroots power? Democracy circles use the power of your existing relationships to bring more people into the fight for democracy, deepen understanding, and link to strategic ongoing grassroots efforts. Democracy circles are small groups of people who join together regularly to demand the kind of democracy we need, a truly multiracial, multicultural democracy that represents us all. For more information on these and other events and programs at the Workers' Circle, please visit us at circle.org/events. I'm Anthony Mordechai Tzvi Russell, and this has been the first of our two-part series, Critical Crossroads, in conversation with Emily Tamkin. Have a good night.